They told you Rome ruled the ancient world, that every road, every law, every ounce of civilization flowed out of that marble empire, that Africa was somewhere off the map, primitive, silent, waiting to be discovered. That's cute, because long before Rome called itself eternal, an African city made it bleed. Carthage, a name they barely whisper in classrooms, yet one that once made Rome wake up shaking. You ever notice how they never teach you that? How they'll show you Caesar but not the man who made him possible? Because Rome learned fear from Africa. Carthage wasn't some desert outpost. It was a superpower, a seafaring, trading, engineering, black-led civilization sitting right on the edge of the Mediterranean in what's now Tunisia. They don't like to say that part because once you realize Carthage was an African city, rich, strategic, brilliant, the whole Europe birthed civilization. Narrative starts to crack like old paint. Before Rome could conquer, Carthage had already mastered the game. They built ships that could outmaneuver Roman fleets. They engineered harbors so complex that modern architects still study them. They traded gold, glass, and grain across 3 continents. And at their heart stood a people called the Punic, descendants of Africans and Phoenicians, children of both land and sea. Their empire stretched across North Africa, Spain, and the islands of the Mediterranean. A black empire in every sense that mattered. But when history's written by the victors, power gets whitewashed. That's why most folks only know Carthage through Rome's hate. The Punic Wars, they call them, like it was some simple military conflict. Nah, it was a century-so-long campaign of jealousy and destruction because Rome couldn't stand to see Africa winning. Now, here's where it gets wild. Out of Carthage rose a man so brilliant, so dangerous to Rome's myth of superiority, that they erased him from the hero books. Hannibal Barca. They'll tell you he was a Carthaginian general. What they won't say is Hannibal was African royalty. Born in North Africa, raised on war strategy, fluent in multiple languages, trained to defend his people from imperial greed. From the time he was a child, he swore an oath to never let Rome dominate his homeland. That promise would shape history forever. You ever notice how Hollywood paints genius generals as European? Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, but the one man all of them studied? Hannibal, an African who outsmarted the world's most arrogant empire. Picture this. A young man barely in his 20s taking control of one of the most powerful armies in the world. Tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of elephants, every nation around him trembling. His plan wasn't just to fight Rome, it was to humiliate it, and he did. Hannibal marched his army across the Alps, a death trap of snow, cliffs, and frozen death, with African elephants leading the charge. The Romans laughed when they heard until they saw it with their own eyes. Imagine standing on your homeland and watching a black general descend from the mountains with beasts you've never seen before. His army in perfect formation, and the Roman soldiers shaking in their boots. That's not just war, that's psychological warfare. But here's what hits different. They never tell you how advanced Hannibal's tactics were. The way he read terrain, how he used misdirection, silence, and shadows to turn Rome's discipline against itself. He was centuries ahead of his time. Modern generals still study his moves. The Battle of Cannae, the one where he surrounded and annihilated a Roman army twice his size, is still called one of the greatest military maneuvers in history. So why don't you see his face on the walls of museums? Why is there no Hollywood blockbuster about this African genius who outwitted an empire? You already know the answer. Because the image of a black man defeating Rome doesn't fit the story they want you to believe. They needed Rome to look invincible. They needed Africa to look inferior. So they took Hannibal's victories and buried them under centuries of Latin propaganda. When they couldn't erase him, they distorted him, turned him into a semi-European figure, softened his features, changed his skin tone, and statues and paintings. Same trick they pulled with Jesus, Cleopatra, and every other African icon who threatened their control. Man, imagine being that good and watching history erase you. Imagine leading armies that terrified the greatest empire on earth, only for your descendants to learn about Caesar in school while your name barely gets a paragraph. That's not just erasure, that's strategic amnesia. And yet, Carthage still stands in the bones of our story. The stones of its harbors still whisper. The ruins still remember the days when Africa wasn't just surviving, it was running the game. But here's the part they don't teach you. Rome didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they lied better. They rewrote, repainted, rebranded Africa's brilliance into their own myth of superiority. So the real question is, if Hannibal could outthink Rome on the battlefield, what made them powerful enough to rewrite his story off it? Because if you can erase a man like Hannibal, what else have they buried beneath the rubble of Western civilization? Let's pull back the curtain for a second. Because if you think Carthage was just another name from a dusty textbook, you're missing the point. This wasn't some forgotten city. This was the beating heart of ancient Africa, a global power whose brilliance shook the Mediterranean. And when Rome realized they couldn't match that brilliance, they did the next best thing. They rewrote it. That's how history hides. Not by erasing every trace, but by changing the meaning of what's left behind. They keep the ruins, but bury the truth inside them. So what we see today is a skeleton, not the soul. Now ask yourself, how does a city that rivaled Rome disappear from memory? How does a man who almost ended Roman expansion get reduced to a trivia question? Simple. Because Rome didn't just destroy Carthage with fire, they destroyed it with narrative. Here's what most people don't know. After the Third Punic War, when Rome finally overpowered Carthage, they didn't stop at victory. They burned the city to the ground. For 17 days, the flames rose so high, sailors could see them miles away. Then, and this is the part they never print in the textbooks, Rome salted the earth so nothing could grow again. A symbolic act, a message to the world. Let this be the end of Africa's glory. But the real violence came later. In the scrolls, in the retellings in the classroom, Roman historians like Livy and Polybius wrote the story not as witnesses, but as architects of a myth. They called Carthage barbaric. They painted Hannibal as ruthless. They said his army was full of savages and mercenaries, men who fought without honor. Sound familiar? It's the same language colonial powers used centuries later to describe Africa again. That's the hidden source. The propaganda pipeline that started long before slavery, before colonization, before the transatlantic trade. It began with the erasure of Carthage. When Rome took Africa's greatest empire and twisted it into a cautionary tale, they planted the seed of the inferior Africa myth that still grows today. But let's rewind, because Carthage didn't come from nowhere. This city was built on the shoulders of ancient African and Phoenician knowledge. Traders, astronomers, engineers, people who mapped the stars in the sea before Rome even had a navy. They mastered metallurgy, agriculture, architecture. Carthage was the kind of city that built double walls, not because they were afraid, but because they thought on levels Rome couldn't even see. Picture the harbor of Carthage, a perfect circle carved from stone, 2 rings, one inside the other, the outer ring for merchants, the inner for warships, hundreds of docks, each with hidden passageways connecting to supply depots and armories. It was a masterpiece of African engineering and urban planning. When European archaeologists first uncovered it, they were stunned because it didn't fit their story. Africa wasn't supposed to be that advanced. You ever notice how discoveries like that barely make headlines? When they find pyramids, manuscripts, or scientific relics in Africa, they call it mysterious. When they find the same thing in Europe, it's brilliant. That's how bias hides in plain sight. It's not what they tell you, it's what they don't. Carthage was also one of the first cities in the world to experiment with democracy and trade-based governance. They had courts, senates, elected officials, all before Rome refined the concept. Aristotle himself once said, Carth had one of the best governments of its time. Let that sink in. The father of Western philosophy, praising an African system. Yet somehow that part never made it into our world history lessons. And here's the deeper truth. Rome didn't just fear Carthage's power. They feared its example. Because Carthage proved that Africa didn't need Europe to define civilization. It showed that black and brown people could build, innovate, and dominate without being saved. That scared them. So, they built an entire narrative machine to make sure that story died. Rome may have won the war, but they couldn't erase the receipts. You can still see it in the ruins, in the coins, with African profiles, in the trade routes stretching from the Sahara to Spain. You can even see it in the strategies Rome later claimed as their own. The Romans copied Carthaginian ship designs. They stole their naval techniques. They learned from Hannibal, then buried his name under centuries of Latin pride. That's why this story matters today. Because it's not just about Carthage. It's about how the blueprint of erasure was built. They destroyed Carthage, then turned around and told the world Africa had no history. That's psychological warfare at its oldest form. Control the story, control the legacy, control the people. Man, imagine growing up hearing that your ancestors had no civilization when in truth they taught civilization. Carthage was proof. The Moors, Mali, Ethiopia, Nubia, all proof. But they needed Rome to be the first, the greatest, the origin. So Africa had to disappear. But here's what's poetic. No matter how deep they buried it, the truth still finds a way to surface. The ruins still speak. The sea still guards its secrets. The bloodlines still remember. And if Carthage, the city Rome tried to erase, still whispers its name across the waves, what else might history's silence be hiding? Because when the victors control the ink, the real question becomes, who's rewriting your past while you're still living their lie? Let's talk about the holes. Not the stories that were told, but the ones that were cut out. The missing pieces, because every history has them. When you study ancient Africa, you start to notice the same pattern again and again. A record gets broken. A city goes unnamed. An artifact gets misplaced. And when it reappears, it's suddenly part of someone else's legacy. That's not coincidence. That's choreography. Take the Library of Alexandria, for example. Everyone knows it burned, but few talk about what it actually contained. Scrolls from across Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Astronomical maps, medical records, mathematical theories, scholars from Carthage, Egypt, Kush, and Timbuktu exchanged ideas there long before the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Those weren't primitive civilizations. They were the foundation. And yet, when you flip open a Western textbook, those same achievements are credited to the Greeks or Romans. Why? Because many of the original manuscripts were translated, rebranded, and reattributed after Alexandria fell. You can literally trace passages of African origin philosophy resurfacing centuries later in European texts, word for word, just under different names. That's not a coincidence. That's historical laundering. Now imagine you're a student in Rome or Athens or Paris hundreds of years later. You're taught that civilization began with your ancestors. You're told Africa was the dark continent. You grow up believing that narrative so deeply that when someone shows you evidence to the contrary, you reject it. That's how deep narrative conditioning runs. And that's exactly what happened with Carthage. The Romans didn't just destroy the city, they destroyed the context. Archaeological digs from the 19th and 20th centuries show how many artifacts from North Africa were quietly shipped off to European museums. mislabeled, or locked away in private collections. When archaeologists found advanced metal tools and ornate sculptures with distinctly African features, they didn't fit the expected narrative. So instead of asking how, they simply said they couldn't have been African. They invented new terms like Afro-Phoenician or Near Eastern influence, anything but African excellence. And the saddest part, even African scholars working under colonial systems were forced to teach that same framework. Imagine being told to deny your own lineage just to pass your exams. Let's zoom in for a second on Hannibal, the man himself, the Carthaginian general who led an army, elephants included, across the Alps to invade Italy, still considered one of the greatest military minds in human history. You'd think his story would be everywhere, right? Statues, monuments, movies, but no, you rarely see his face because his face complicates things. Many historians now believe Hannibal was of mixed North African and Phoenician descent, possibly with dark skin. But the Roman records written by his enemies never mentioned his appearance in detail. And the art that survives, drawn centuries later, lightens his features every time. It's subtle, it's deliberate, it's the visual equivalent of a whisper being edited out of a song. Now, let's talk about the books, the ones that never survived. Roman generals famously burned Carthaginian libraries after the conquest, but one survived long enough to influence future generations: the works of Mago, Carthage's most respected agricultural scientist. His writings on crop rotation, irrigation, and soil management were so advanced that Rome actually translated them into Latin after destroying his homeland. Then, they credited themselves for the discoveries. Think about that. They killed the civilization, but kept the knowledge. Just removed the author's name. It's like deleting the signature from a masterpiece. Fast forward to the 1400s. As European explorers pushed into Africa, they were shocked to find bustling cities, complex governments, and universities. In Timbuktu alone, there were libraries filled with thousands of handwritten manuscripts, astronomy, medicine, poetry, philosophy. These were not lost tribes. These were learned societies. So what did the explorers do? They took what they could, burned what they couldn't, and rewrote what was left, just like Rome did to Carthage. The same blueprint: copy, erase, rebrand. Even the very word Carthage comes to us through Latin, not the Punic or Berber words that the people themselves used. We don't even know what they called their own city. Rome erased even that. This is the quiet violence of history. It's not swords and flames. It's pens and archives. It's the museum plaque that calls an African sculpture influenced by Greek design. It's the school curriculum that turns entire empires into a footnote. But here's the thing about the missing pieces. They always leave traces. You can feel them in the gaps, in the silences between what we're told and what feels wrong. Every time an archaeologist uncovers a ruin that's too advanced for its supposed time period, a missing piece is trying to speak. Every time a historian finds an African name buried in a Roman ledger, another voice is coming back. And that's the beauty of rediscovery. The truth doesn't vanish. It just waits for someone curious enough to notice it's missing. Because the real story of Carthage, of Africa, isn't just what was lost. It's what they couldn't destroy. The memory, the innovation, the persistence. Even when they burned the books, the knowledge passed through bloodlines, through craftsmanship, through oral tradition. The empire may have fallen, but the idea that Africa could stand as a pillar of human progress never did. And once you start seeing the missing pieces, you can't unsee them. You start realizing that history isn't just about who lived and died. It's about who wrote it down and who they decided to erase. Before there were military geniuses, before Europe crowned its Napoleons and Caesars, there was a man who studied the world like it was a chessboard. And he never played for pride. He played for survival. His name was Hannibal Barca. You know how they say history is written by the victors? Well, the story of Hannibal is what happens when the loser was smarter than everyone else and they couldn't stand it. Let's set the stage. The year is 247 BCE. Carthage is cornered. Rome has already crushed their navy in the First Punic War, stripped their lands, and forced them to pay a debt so big it could bankrupt a nation twice over. But Carthage, they don't bow, they build. And from the ashes, a boy is born into a family that refuses to be erased. His father, Hannibal Barca, was a warlord, a strategist, and a visionary who believed Carthage could rise again. Before one of his campaigns, he brought young Hannibal to the altar and made him swear an oath that he would never stop fighting Rome. Not in his lifetime, not in his soul. That was the birth of the legend. Now imagine growing up in exile, seeing your homeland humiliated, your father die in foreign wars, and your people's pride reduced to dust. For most, that kind of pain breeds despair. But for Hannibal, it bred precision. He studied everything: geography, weather, animal behavior, human psychology, even propaganda. He learned to weaponize nature itself. When he finally took command of the Carthaginian army, he didn't just plan to fight Rome. He planned to outthink it. And that's exactly what he did. In 218 BCE, Hannibal did something no Roman could even imagine. He marched his army and his elephants through the Pyrenees across the Rhone River and straight over the Alps. That's right. The man dragged war beasts across ice and mountain peaks just to catch Rome from behind. It was the ancient world's version of breaking the simulation. Historians still argue how he pulled it off, how he kept tens of thousands of men alive through freezing temperatures, treacherous slopes, and hostile tribes. But the real answer lies in his psychology. Hannibal didn't see obstacles. He saw opportunities to break his enemy's imagination. Think about it. Rome had the numbers, the infrastructure, the legions, the reputation. They were the superpower. But Hannibal understood something they didn't. Fear is the oldest weapon of all. When the Romans heard he'd crossed the Alps, it shattered their belief that they were untouchable. And then came Cannae. The year was 216 BCE, the battlefield, a dusty plain in southern Italy. Rome brought over 80,000 soldiers. Hannibal, barely half that. It should have been a massacre, but instead, Hannibal pulled off one of the most brilliant maneuvers in military history, a move that's still studied in war armies today. He let Rome's army push forward into his center intentionally. Then, as the Romans thought they were breaking his lines, he encircled them from both sides. A complete pincer movement. Within hours, over 50,000 Romans were dead, an entire army crushed by strategy. And yet, they still call Napoleon the father of strategy. You ever notice how they always rename brilliance when it's black? They call it luck, cunning, or instinct. Anything but genius. But Hannibal's intellect was undeniable. He didn't just beat Rome. He rewired the way wars were fought. Logistics, espionage, psychological warfare. He mastered all of it before the world even had the words. He used local tribes as allies, spoke their languages, adapted his culture to theirs. While Rome demanded loyalty through conquest, Hannibal earned it through respect. He knew that power without understanding is temporary. That's not just warfare, that's wisdom. But Rome couldn't stand the humiliation. They couldn't accept that the greatest threat to their empire came from an African general. So they rewrote him. In their stories, he became a monster, a barbarian, a foreign menace. Even his victories were reframed as accidents. And when they couldn't beat him on the battlefield, they turned to politics. They cut off his supply lines. They bribed his allies. They starved him of reinforcements. See, Rome learned from Hannibal, but they didn't learn his honor. Eventually, Carthage recalled him home, not to celebrate him, to silence him. His success had made him too powerful, too feared, even by his own leaders. The same city he swore to protect turned its back on him. That's the price of brilliance in a world that fears your light. He went into exile, moving across foreign kingdoms, still advising, still fighting, still teaching. But Rome never forgot him. They chased him for decades. They couldn't rest until the man who once terrified their empire was gone. When they finally closed in, Hannibal didn't give them the satisfaction. He took his own life rather than be paraded through their streets in chains. His last reported words, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced." Even in death, he played by his own rules. And here's the part that stings centuries later. European historians would still write about Hannibal with admiration, but they'd bleach his identity in the process. They'd call him Semitic, Phoenician, Mediterranean, anything but African, anything but black. Because to admit that one of the greatest military minds in history was African, that would mean rewriting the entire narrative of Western superiority. So ask yourself, if Hannibal had been born in Greece, would he have been called the father of strategy? If his skin were lighter, would there be 10 Hollywood movies about him by now? History remembers what it wants to remember, but truth always leaves fingerprints, and Hannibal's fingerprints are still all over the strategies, the philosophies, and the psychology of warfare used to this day. The man who outsmarted Rome didn't just fight an empire. He exposed the fear beneath its armor. But the question is, what happens when you realize the man who terrified the Romans didn't just defend Carthage? He defined Africa's genius. Before Greece had marble, before Rome had roads, before Europe even had a name for civilization, Africa had empires. That's the part the textbooks never linger on. They tell you Carthage was a trading hub, like it was just a marketplace by the sea. But Carthage was an empire, an African empire, one that mastered commerce, governance, agriculture, navigation, and engineering, on a level Rome had to study just to imitate. Let's get something straight. Carthage didn't borrow its brilliance from Europe. It exported it. The city sat like a jewel on the North African coast, shimmering between the Mediterranean blue and the Sahara's gold. It wasn't a backwater port. It was the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. Engineers, philosophers, astronomers, and merchants moved through its streets like currents. The architecture wasn't random. It was rhythmic, geometric, mathematical. And that's no coincidence. Carthage inherited the blueprint from the ancestors, from Kemet, from Nubia, from the Nile Valley civilizations that mapped the stars, while Europe was still figuring out how to stack stones straight. You see, the Phoenician traders Rome talks about didn't found Carthage. They joined it. They intermarried, integrated, and built upon African foundations that had already existed for millennia. And when the world began to trade, Carthage became the middleman of the Mediterranean, the city where Africa met the world. They had harbors so complex that modern engineers still debate how they pulled them off. Massive circular docks with hidden compartments for warships, warehouses carved with ventilation systems, city planning that followed astronomical alignments. All that in 800 BCE, while the so-called civilized world still thought thunder was Zeus throwing tantrums. And yet, every time you see a documentary about Carthage, notice what they show. White statues, white columns, white sand. They never show the faces of the people who built it, because if they did, the illusion collapses. Ask yourself, why do you think European archaeologists were so quick to reinterpret African ruins? When they found ancient skulls and statues with broad noses and curly hair in Carthage, in Egypt, in Nubia, they called them stylized. When they uncovered advanced metallurgy, irrigation, and astronomical observatories, they called them mysteries. But when the same technology appeared in Greece or Rome, they called it genius. See the pattern? Carthage was a mirror they didn't want to look into because it proved that Africa wasn't just a supplier of resources. It was a producer of knowledge. The city's libraries held texts in multiple languages. Its scholars debated philosophy long before Plato was even born. Its navigators mapped routes across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus ever packed a bag. And that's not speculation, it's evidence. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote about African sailors reaching lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. They described journeys that took years, describing coastlines with such detail they couldn't have been made up. Carthaginian explorer Hanno the Navigator even documented a voyage down the West African coast, complete with encounters, settlements, and trading posts. Hanno wasn't a myth. He was the first recorded sailor to map sub-Saharan Africa. His expedition was funded by Carthage's Senate, meaning this wasn't curiosity, it was infrastructure, it was expansion. Carthage didn't just sail the seas, it commanded them. Its navy outmaneuvered Rome's for decades. Thanks to African innovation and shipbuilding, they developed the quintar, a massive warship with 5 banks of oars, centuries ahead of its time. They coated hulls with a resin that resisted salt corrosion, making voyages last longer. When Rome finally figured out how to copy those ships, they literally stole a wrecked Carthaginian vessel and reverse engineered it. And even then, it took them years to match Carthage's design. Let that sink in. Rome learned to rule the sea by stealing African technology and the trade networks Carthage created. They stretched across continents, gold, ivory, iron, and textiles from sub-Saharan Africa, spices and gems from India, tin from Britain, amber from the Baltics. Carthage wasn't a city, it was a system. Now, here's the crazy part. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, they didn't just burn a city, they burned a memory. They ordered every building torn down, every citizen enslaved, and every record destroyed. Salted the ground so nothing could grow again. That wasn't strategy. That was fear. Because Carthage had proven something Rome couldn't afford the world to remember, that an African civilization could rival the might of the empire that claimed to rule the world. And when Rome built its new city on those ashes, it rebuilt the myth. They painted Carthage as a greedy merchant city obsessed with gold and sacrifice. They twisted Hannibal into a monster. They turned victory into virtue and genocide into civilization. It's the same formula they'd use later on Africa itself. Destroy, demonize, then dominate. But here's the thing. The soil remembers every artifact, every inscription, every buried dock whispers the same truth. Africa was first, not second, not sidekick, not inspired by first. The original architect of empire, innovation, and intellect in Carthage. It was proof that Africa didn't need Europe. Europe needed Africa. So ask yourself, if the Romans had to destroy every trace of Carthage just to rewrite the story, what other empires have been buried under the same lie? What if Carthage wasn't an exception, but a blueprint? See, history ain't just written by the winners. It's edited by the insecure. Rome didn't destroy Carthage because it was evil. Rome destroyed Carthage because it was proof. Proof that Africa didn't need saving. That Africa had already done the saving. And that, my friend, is the kind of truth that threatens an empire. Because once you admit that Carthage rivaled Rome, that Hannibal outsmarted every Roman general before him, that African innovation built the ships Rome sailed on and the tactics it copied, you pull the mask off Western civilization. You expose the illusion. Ask yourself, if they had nothing to hide, why did they bury everything? When the Romans razed Carthage to the ground, it wasn't just about conquest. It was about control. They burned the libraries, enslaved the scholars, and scattered the people. But they didn't stop there. They launched a propaganda campaign centuries before the word even existed. They rewrote reports, redrew maps, and reimagined history to make Carthage look like a villain. In their version, Carthage wasn't an African powerhouse. It was a greedy, barbaric, child-sacrificing society that deserved its fate. They painted Hannibal, one of the greatest military minds the world has ever seen, as a savage brute. But look closely at those same Roman texts. Even in their insults, you can feel the fear because Rome barely survived him. Hannibal made them bleed. He crossed the Alps with elephants through snow, through ice, through the impossible. His soldiers weren't mercenaries. They were believers. North Africans, Nubians, Iberians, Moors, a coalition of free people who refused to kneel. And Rome was humiliated. Imagine an African general walking into Europe, dismantling their armies with strategy so advanced. It's still studied in military schools today. No satellites, no maps, just brilliance, courage, and precision. They couldn't erase the battles, so they rewrote the man. They painted him lighter, softened his features, blurred his origin. Over centuries, Western historians reinterpreted Hannibal's identity, calling him Mediterranean, Semitic, or Phoenician. Anything but African, anything but black. They used words like Punic to hide African. They used Canaanite to avoid saying descendant of the Nile. Because if Hannibal was black, then the foundation of military genius shifts south toward Africa. And that means Europe's greatest empire learned from the very people it tried to enslave. Now that's a problem for the narrative. The manipulation didn't stop there. After Rome fell, the Christian church inherited its power and its prejudice. The same church that preached humility also learned the art of rewriting. It repainted saints, it recolored prophets, and it sanitized every trace of African brilliance that connected back to power, leadership, or divine purpose. Carthage was ground zero for that erasure. The new rulers of the Mediterranean couldn't let the people remember that Africa once owned those seas, that the same land they called dark once glowed with knowledge. So they buried the ruins, misclassified the art, and mistranslated the texts. When 19th century European archaeologists rediscovered Carthage, they played the same game all over again. They called the African artifacts influenced by the East. They credited Phoenicia for every African invention, even though Phoenicia was a small strip of land that never built anything near Carthage's scale. You ever notice how they do that? Every time Africa builds something great, they claim outside influence. But when Europe copies it, suddenly it's innovation. That's not coincidence. That's programming. Because if you control the image, you control the imagination. And if you control imagination, you control identity. Rome didn't just conquer Carthage's land. It conquered how the story of Carthage would be told. And when Europe resurrected Rome centuries later during the Renaissance, they didn't resurrect the truth. They resurrected the myth. They celebrated Rome as civilization reborn and painted Africa as its opposite, primitive, superstitious, broken. They created a racial hierarchy rooted in those lies, one that justified colonization, slavery, and theft, all from a lie that began in Carthage. But think about this. The Romans built monuments to themselves, but the Carthaginians built legacies that outlasted fire. You can burn a library, but you can't burn memory. You can't erase DNA. You can't erase what's written in the bones of the people. And when the Moors rose centuries later, bringing African science, medicine, and philosophy back into Europe, where do you think that flame came from? It came from Carthage. From that same spark, Rome thought it had buried under ash. So yeah, they changed the story, but they couldn't change the truth. And here's the twist. That same propaganda model that Rome used, it's still in play today. The same cycle of erasure, rebranding, and control has evolved with the times. Now it's not scrolls and scribes doing the rewriting. It's textbooks, films, and media. They still tell you Africa rose and fell. They still act like greatness was a phase, not a foundation. But once you know how to read between the lines, you start seeing the fingerprints. It's all connected from the fires of Carthage to the screens of today. One continuous campaign to make you forget who you are, where you came from, and what your people built. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. If they were willing to destroy an entire empire just to control the narrative, how far do you think they went to control you? The dawn mist rolled over the mountains of Numidia, curling around the encampment of a man Rome called the Demon of Africa. His name was Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, descendant of a line that had once traded gold, salt, and ivory long before any Roman dreamed of empire. In the hush of morning, young Hannibal stood before his father, watching flames twist in a bronze bowl. Hamilcar pressed a dagger to his son's palm. "Swear it," he said. "Swear you will never be a friend of Rome." The boy's blood mixed with the smoke, a covenant sealed not in ink, but in fire. From that moment, Africa's most brilliant strategist was born. Carthage was not a land of savages or pirates. As later Roman historians claimed, it was a technological powerhouse. The docks could build 200 ships at once. Engineers used molten lead to waterproof holes. Farmers used advanced irrigation systems imported from sub-Saharan Africa. They had laws, libraries, mathematics, and a fleet that ruled the Mediterranean centuries before Europe even built proper ports. But Rome wanted control. They called it civilization. Carthage called it greed. When war came, Hannibal didn't meet them on his shores. He took the fight to theirs. He marched his African elephants through the Alps, a move so insane, so brilliant, that generals today still study it. He didn't just bring elephants. He brought an army united from across the African continent. Numidians, Berbers, Moors, black warriors from the Sahel, all fighting under the Carthaginian banner. Picture that frost biting their skin. Roman scouts watching from the cliffs in disbelief as dark silhouettes emerged through the snow, leading massive beasts that shook the earth. Hannibal wasn't just a tactician, he was a psychologist. He understood fear as a weapon. At Cannae, he arranged his troops in a crescent shape, baiting the Romans into his center, then closing the trap from both sides. A maneuver that destroyed 50,000 men in a single afternoon. That's not luck. That's mastery. That's African genius. Yet, when history was rewritten by Rome, when Europe later told the story, they painted Hannibal as a monster, not a mastermind. They erased Carthage's African identity, whitewashed its achievements, and burned its archives after the final war. All that remained were Roman words describing their enemy, the same empire that salted the soil of Carthage so nothing could grow again. But what if I told you Rome didn't destroy everything? What if I told you some Carthaginian knowledge survived, hidden through time, carried by sailors who reached far beyond Europe, leaving echoes of their science in places historians still can't explain? Carthage may have burned, but its fire still lives. You ever notice how they call it the classical world? Like Greece and Rome invented everything. That's cute. Cute because while Europe was still debating philosophy with little more than scrolls and wax tablets, Africa was already building cities, mapping the stars, encoding knowledge into stone and papyrus. Carthage wasn't an anomaly. It was a reflection of a continent that had been teaching the world for millennia. The African mind was not waiting for permission to shine. It was already illuminating civilization. Let's start with navigation. Before Columbus discovered the Americas, African sailors had already mapped the Atlantic coast. They understood wind patterns, ocean currents, and celestial navigation in ways that would make European explorers seem like toddlers fumbling with compasses. Hanno, the navigator centuries before Rome's conquest of Carthage, sailed from the Mediterranean down the West African coast, establishing trade posts, mapping unknown lands, and documenting it all in incredible detail. That knowledge didn't vanish. It spread past orally through apprenticeship, through diaspora, mathematics. Africa wasn't counting with sticks. They were calculating areas, volumes, and astronomical events. The ancient Egyptians gave the world geometry and algebra. Carthage refined those principles for engineering, trade, and military strategy. Rome copied them. Europe praised itself. That's how the story was twisted. The blueprint was African. The credit was European. Medicine, chemistry, astronomy, architecture, philosophy, all flowing from African minds. Think about it. Europe's Renaissance was a reawakening of ideas stolen, learned, and adapted from Africa. Libraries of Alexandria and Carthage held texts that chronicled centuries of African scientific exploration. Works on medicine described herbal remedies that modern science is only now validating. Mathematics taught precision in trade, construction, and naval navigation. Every invention that later defined Europe had an African ancestor. Ask yourself, why do you think African contributions are always footnotes in European textbooks? Why is the Nile Valley only ever ancient Egypt in isolation, as if the surrounding lands, the scholars and the thinkers, had nothing to do with its brilliance? Here's the thing. Knowledge is power. And if you control knowledge, you control history. That's why Rome burned Carthage. That's why later empires stole African manuscripts. That's why European narratives whitewashed gods, pharaohs, and heroes. Because Africa's power was undeniable, and power must be denied to maintain dominance. Look closer. Philosophy wasn't born in Greece. It was cultivated along the Nile, refined in the libraries of Carthage, debated in marketplaces of Timbuktu. When Aristotle, Plato, and Pythagoras were writing their treatises, African thinkers were centuries ahead, developing logic, ethics, astronomy, and mathematics that would later feed into European curricula without acknowledgement. And don't get it twisted, this knowledge was accessible. Carthaginian merchants, West African traders, scholars in Ethiopia, they shared knowledge with anyone who respected it, who could read the signs of the stars and follow the rivers. Unlike Europe, which hoarded knowledge behind Latin texts and elite privileges, African knowledge spread like the wind across deserts and seas. Cultural transmission didn't stop at Africa. African ideas traveled with the Moors into Spain, with every mosque built, every library open, every academy formed. African science, philosophy, and architecture flowed into Europe, invisibly powering the Renaissance. Bridges, aqueducts, domes, and the very concept of urban planning. African Europe took the credit. They repackaged it as their own. Even religion wasn't untouched. Carthage and broader African thought contributed to early Christian theology, ethical frameworks, and the mystical interpretations that Rome later sanitized. African prophets, philosophers, and teachers helped shape doctrines, moral codes, and spiritual practices that would later be claimed by European clerics as their own divine insight. Imagine that. The hands that shaped logic, the minds that plotted the stars, the hearts that carried spiritual guidance, erased from the story and recast as foreign, distant, or other. And yet the footprint remained, hidden in manuscripts, hidden in architectural designs, hidden in oral histories across the diaspora. The African mind never disappeared. It was only rebranded, waiting for the world to remember. So, here's the moment to pause and feel it. The betrayal, the theft, the pride, and the fire. Africa taught the world. Africa invented the tools of civilization. Africa set the blueprint. And yet, for centuries, The world acted like it had just stumbled upon enlightenment on its own. Ask yourself this: if Africa was already centuries ahead in science, math, navigation, and philosophy, why do we still think civilization started in Europe? Why are our textbooks still lying to us? And here's the deeper question: if knowledge equals power, and Africa's knowledge was stolen, how much power was stolen along with it? Let's talk about the pharaohs, the ones Europe won't show you in history books. You know the ones. Tall, regal figures with gold crowns, majestic stances, commanding armies, building monuments that still baffle engineers today. The ones whose names you think you know: Cleopatra, Enoton, Ramses. But here's the truth: those weren't pale rulers. They were black, full African Nile bred kings and queens whose bloodlines carried the weight of empires older than Rome, older than Greece, older than even the Bible in the form you've been fed. Look at the murals, the sculptures, the carvings, wide noses, full lips, tightly coiled hair. Look at the hieroglyphs, the records of dynasties, wars, and spiritual guidance written by African hands. Ask yourself, why do textbooks replace their faces with lighter skin, European features, and blonde hair? Because power is preserved through image. Change the image and you change the story. These weren't minor leaders. They were visionaries, warriors, mathematicians, astronomers, and prophets. Pharaohs like Pa and Tahara expanded the Nile empires, building pyramids that still dwarf European castles. They didn't just conquer. They taught, traded, and exchanged ideas across Africa and beyond. Their scribes documented celestial movements with such precision that modern scholars still marvel. Their temples aligned with the stars, structures that required both engineering genius and philosophical insight. And the prophets, Africa had them long before the European church canonized the Old Testament. Ethiopian priests, Nubian mystics, Carthaginian scholars, men and women whose spiritual authority challenged the world's perception of divinity. They advised kings, guided armies, and wrote teachings that would later be adapted, distorted, and claimed by others. They weren't mere storytellers. They were architects of morality, visionaries, shaping society through ethical law, philosophy, and the understanding of the cosmos. Ask yourself, how does a continent produce leaders capable of mapping stars, ruling vast lands, and sustaining complex economies? Yet, Europe pretends it discovered civilization centuries later. It's not discovery, it's theft, it's erasure. Take Tahara, the Nubian pharaoh who ruled Egypt at its height. Rome later wrote him off as a minor foreign invader. But he wasn't an outsider. He was a guardian of African continuity, a bridge between Nile Valley civilizations, a black man whose armies defended cities against foreign conquest. Every time Rome tried to claim legitimacy, they quietly destroyed records of his reign, removed his statues, and misrepresented his image. The goal, make it look like greatness, had always been European. Even Cleopatra, the so-called Greek queen of Egypt, was African, Punic by name. Yes, but her ancestry was deeply entwined with the Nile, Nubian, Kushite, and African royalty. Man, if Cleopatra had Instagram, half these history books would delete themselves. She wasn't a foreign European figure ruling Africa. She was African leadership, blending diplomacy, strategy, and charisma in a world designed to erase her. And here's the kicker. Every one of these leaders had advisors, generals, scholars, and prophets who were black men and women. They were Carthaginians, Nubians, Moors. They strategized battles, negotiated peace, trained armies, and chronicled history. Yet, Europe painted them as secondary characters, footnotes, or exotic others in the grand narrative of civilization. Ask yourself, how much of what you think you know about Egypt, Carthage, or Nubia is true? and how much has been filtered through centuries of manipulation. Every statue that was restored in a museum, every mural that was repainted, every historical text rewritten, it's not accidental. It's psychological warfare. It's a lesson in control. If you own the image of history, you own how people perceive power. But here's the thing. Evidence doesn't lie. Bones, artifacts, hieroglyphs, oral traditions, they all scream the truth. Black pharaohs weren't a myth. African prophets weren't a legend. They were reality. The same reality that Rome, Europe, and later the West tried to bury under layers of distortion, racism, and fear. And while their faces may have been lightened in textbooks, their achievements, their spirit, and their legacy can't be erased. They built civilizations, moved empires, and shaped the blueprint of the world we live in today. So, here's the question to leave burning in your mind. If the very architects of civilization were black, if the original prophets were African, then what does that say about every story we've been told about who built the world and who profited from pretending they didn't? Because once you see the truth, once you recognize the faces, the lineage, the intellectual power, the betrayal hits different, and the fire to reclaim it, that's unstoppable. Picture Europe in the 8th century, cold, fractured, stumbling in the dark. Rome's glory was gone, knowledge buried under centuries of conquest and fear. People called it the Dark Ages. Dark for who? Because Africa was glowing. Enter the Moors, scholars, engineers, philosophers, mathematicians, doctors, navigators, black men and women from North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. They didn't just cross the Strait of Gibraltar, they brought civilization with them. They arrived with books, instruments, maps, and blueprints for a world Europe had forgotten existed. Cordoba, Granada, Fez, cities that sparkled with light, libraries filled with manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of texts detailing medicine, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, far more advanced than anything in Europe at the time. Hospitals, aqueducts, public baths, and universities, all African innovation, all sustaining human life in ways Europeans wouldn't see for centuries. And yes, they taught, they translated, they preserved, they handed the torch to anyone willing to learn. Europe got its renaissance, but it wasn't a birth. It was a revival of African knowledge, stolen, sanitized, and then credited to Italian scholars. You ever notice how we only hear about Leonardo, Galileo, and Michelangelo? Cute. Europe had nothing on the foundations laid by the Moors. Algebra, algorithms, trigonometry, even the very concept of zero preserved and expanded upon by African minds in Moorish Spain. Libraries like Al-Karawi and Inf, standing today, held knowledge older than any European university. Medicine hospitals staffed with African doctors, treating tens of thousands daily, performing surgeries, teaching hygiene, saving lives. Europe was still bleeding ignorance when the Moors were performing cataract surgery. Europe's medical textbooks, centuries later, borrowed directly from these manuscripts, but they rarely credited the source. Agriculture, architecture, astronomy, philosophy, law, the Moors saved it all. They reintroduced science, commerce, and culture back into Europe. They stabilized economies, taught irrigation systems, and mapped the stars so Europe could navigate oceans it had never dreamed of. And the best part, they did it with style. Palaces with geometric perfection, gardens designed to reflect the cosmos. Calligraphy is decoration teaching that art and science are one. They didn't just rebuild Europe. They refined humanity, but history books, they call it conquest. They call it Muslim occupation or Arab rule, erasing the black African identity of the Moors. They strip the faces, change the names, repaint the story. It's psychological warfare, make the architects invisible, make the world forget the blueprint came from Africa. Ask yourself, how did the Moors manage to transmit knowledge across centuries while Europe slept through its own collapse? Why is the story told as if Europe pulled itself out of ignorance by itself, ignoring the hands that literally built the ladders it climbed? These weren't minor contributions. They were civilization receipts. Receipts Rome burned, Europe sanitized, and history textbooks misplaced. Algebra, receipt from the Moors. Optics, receipt from the Moors. University systems, receipt from the Moors. And yet, when people talk about progress, it's always framed as European ingenuity. And that's the sneaky part. It wasn't just Europe that lost its memory. Africa itself was fractured by conquest and the slave trade, cutting lines of knowledge, dispersing scholars, and scattering manuscripts across oceans. But those Moors, resilient, brilliant, kept the flame alive. They were scholars, traders, warriors, and diplomats. They were the reason Europe survived intellectually after Rome's fall. Now imagine standing in Cordoba or Granada, walking among libraries that housed tens of thousands of texts, knowing that Africa had preserved the knowledge that would one day lead to telescopes, clocks, and the very sciences we take for granted. You feel a kind of pride mixed with anger, don't you? Because Europe owes its renaissance to Black Africa, plain and simple. Without the Moors, the European rebirth would have been delayed centuries. Yet, we hear none of that. They erased the fingerprints while leaving the structures intact, teaching a lesson in power. Control the story. Control the legacy. And here's the twist. Some of that knowledge made it across the Atlantic, carried by African navigators and enslaved peoples, seeding ideas in the Americas long before Europeans discovered them. Every time we think about navigation, agriculture, or astronomy in the New World, we have to ask who really taught them first. So, yeah, the Moors saved Europe, and yet Europe painted them as invaders, foreigners, outsiders. They forgot to mention the skin color, the lineage, the brilliance. That omission, that's intentional. That's why history feels incomplete. That's why it's ours to reclaim. Ask yourself, if civilization itself owes a debt to Africa that's never been repaid in recognition, what else have they erased? And more importantly, how do we reclaim it today? Let's get real. You ever walk into a museum or flip open a history textbook and feel something is off? Yeah, that feeling is correct. They've been lying systematically, methodically, whitewashing the past until it gleams with someone else's reflection. Take art. Renaissance painters commissioned by wealthy patrons were rewriting history. Every saint, every king, every philosopher painted pale, eyes blue, noses thin, skin white. Even Jesus, even the apostles. European faces staring back at you like they owned the world. That's not artistic license. That's psychological control. Make the heroes foreign. Make the witnesses invisible. And you teach the world to forget its roots. Books weren't safe either. Every manuscript that contradicted the European narrative was burned, hidden, or translated with intentional bias. African kingdoms became mysterious or savage. Carthage, a footnote. Nubia, a forgotten land. The Moors, merely occupiers in the textbooks, not the saviors of European knowledge. It wasn't a mistake. It was power. History is written by winners, sure. But who wins when the winner erases the architect? Rome won militarily. Europe won culturally by default, but Africa's narrative was stolen, twisted, and sold as a fantasy. Paint a black god white, and suddenly his people don't exist. Rewrite the textbooks, and suddenly they were never part of the conversation. And propaganda, it's more than just textbooks. Religion was used as a weapon. Preachers, missionaries, and clerics reinforced the lie. Civilization comes from the civilized Europeans while Africa provided exotic scenery or labor.